Thank you very much for that. I liked the part in that where it says, can you read the labels? And someone says, yes, of course I can. Well, that is the topic of our first panel today on labelling and nutrition and how this can help ensure sustainable and healthy diets. Now, labelling is a big topic in the agri-food sector currently, with the European Commission expected to put forward a proposal for EU-wide labelling scheme at the end of 2022. And this framework is supposed to cover nutritional aspects as well as the sustainable and social elements of food products. So it packs a lot into this one scheme. Of course, this throws up a lot of questions as to how practically this can be achieved. So for this panel discussion today, we have with us today centre-right MEP Herbert Dorfmann. We have Dirk Jacobs, who is the Deputy Director of Food and Drink Europe. We have Sabine Pelsner, who is Head of Unit for Food Information and Composition at the European Commission. And last but not least, we have Nikolai Pushkarev, who is Policy Coordinator at the European Public Health Alliance, or EPHA. So I will firstly turn to each panelist for a short 10-minute presentation or opening remarks before moving to a Q&A session. So let me just use this as a reminder to keep submitting your questions throughout everything we're about to hear from the panelists. So for our first presentation, I will turn to Herbert. Herbert, the floor is yours for your opening remarks. You have 10 minutes.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity you give me to make some personal reflections on food labeling. But I'm doing this also in my role as a rapporteur, which I have been for the initiative report here in the European Parliament on the Farm to Fork strategy, where for sure is addressed this problem, and we try to find, let's say, a wording what we would expect here in the European Parliament for front of pack labeling. But first of all, I think labels can contribute, and I'm sure in this, to a more balanced and healthier nutrition. But from time to time, this contribution is also overestimated. If we want to come to a healthier, more balanced nutrition, it is not only about labeling, it is also about food education, and if it is about culture of eating. And this I'm saying somebody coming from Italy, where we have, I think, quite an important culture of eating, and eating is simply an important topic in Italy. And this, I think, contributes a lot to a more healthier and a more balanced nutrition. And I think, to give you an example on this, I always remind the situation in other places of this world where food labeling is very good. I think, for example, the US have an excellent food labeling system. But I do not have the impression going to US cities that that food and nutrition in the US is more balanced and healthier than in the European Union. It is not. And the percentage of people who obviously do have a problem with nutrition is much higher than in Europe. And for this, I think we need to find a combination between a better education on balanced food, nutrition, and then we need to inform the consumer, because once the consumer knows what he or she needs to eat or should eat, there needs to be clearly on the label an information about what he or she is going to eat. Well, we found a compromise on our initiative report, the Farm to Fork strategy, where fundamentally we say yes. We are in favor of a new front of pack label, because this new label could help consumer to take healthier decisions. But it needs to provide to the consumer an information which the consumer understands easily, which is based on independent, and I underline independent, scientific evidence. So the algorithm needs to be known, needs to be public. The label needs to be publicly owned and not private owned. There needs to be an open access for all operators on the market, for bigger companies and also for small and medium-sized operators. And this access needs to be at a reasonable price. The information needs to be transparent and with a uniform reference amount. And it needs to take, the system needs to take into account specific products which we have in the European Union, like PDOs, PGIs, so products with geographical indications where it is not that easy or impossible to change the composition from one day to another. And if we see this opinion of the Parliament, say independent, scientifically based, open access, I need to say it cannot be the Nutri-Score, because the Nutri-Score is nor independent, nor is scientifically based, or at least the algorithm is not really known, and there is not an open access for everybody in this moment. And honestly, I'm quite concerned, and I think therefore I'm really thankful that we are doing this conference today, because I think the Commission needs to act, and we as a co-legislator need to act. Because otherwise, systems like the Nutri-Score are a matter of fact. Because we are not debating in the Parliament if the Nutri-Score exists or not. The Nutri-Score today in some member states, as we know, also here in Brussels, is a matter of fact. And I personally, being a bit critical after some experience with big distribution in the food sector, I'm asking myself, if I have a fidelity card of a supermarket chain, and this supermarket chain is giving me extra points on my fidelity card, if I buy products with a green label on the Nutri-Score, what is the aim of the chain, of the supermarket? To provide me a more balanced nutrition. Are we really sure? Or are we giving to the supermarket a new power, a new element to create a monopoly? And this, I think, is really dangerous what is going on in this moment, because after all the abuse which this Parliament with different also legal actions like the unfair trading practices, I think we are giving to the supermarkets another element where they decide at the end what the consumer buys and not the consumer himself. And therefore, I think we need to act, we need to come to a public system. Well, I already come to my end. I think we will hear for sure Sabine Belzler, which will tell us more about this going on in the Commission. But I think we have the very difficult task to find the front of pack labeling, which on one side is easily understandable, as the director of SAFE said before, where a mother or a father going into the supermarket with 3 kids easily understands what he or she is going to buy. But at the same time, we need to avoid that the information becomes too simple or too superficial. And I personally, if I'm looking what's going on with the Nutri-Score in this moment, I think that sometimes we are too simple. And we try to give the consumer information which at the end is simple and also too simple. Because balanced is not a question, balanced food is not a question of a single product. If I wake up in the morning, from waking up to going to sleep, a normal consumer consumes different products. And it may be that in one product there's a bit too much fat, in the other one is a bit too much proteins, and in the other one is a bit too much sugar. But they need to see the food all over the day, or all over the week, all over the month. And sugar or fat or proteins per se are nothing bad. We eat to assume calories. We do not eat just to eat. We need to eat because we need energy for our body. And therefore, there's nothing bad in fat. There's something bad in the problem most of us have, me maybe included, that we eat too much of them. And so I think we need to find a solution where we need to inform the consumer about the contribution of this food to a balanced diet all over the day, all over the week, or all over the month. And therefore, I think we really need a very deep discussion and also with the sector and also with NGOs like you in order to find an information which at the same time is all the consumers understand easily and at the same time give a clear and reliable information to everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Herbert. So on the search for the Goldilocks of labels, not too simple, but simple enough, somewhere in between. Herbert, you raised the issue, you know, are labels being used to create a monopoly, you know, for the food industry, or helping the consumer choose? Dirk, I'm going to turn to you now for your opening remarks. Perhaps you have something to say to that.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and thank you also to SAFE, the organizers, for inviting me to take part in this discussion. Very timely indeed, given that we are talking about consumer information every day almost, whether we are in the shop or also in the Brussels bubble where we discuss policy. For those that do not know Food Drink Europe, we are the organization of the European food and drink manufacturing industry, a sector which consists of over 290,000 companies, 99% of which are small and medium-sized. And even of those 99% of small companies, the vast majority are even small family-owned micro enterprises. We have a very diverse sector, ranging from small to large, but also from traditional production to more technology-driven production, including cheesemakers, brewers, plant-based startups, chocolate producers, coffee producers, bakery ingredients, you name it. So it's already a very wide and diverse sector. And often in these food information discussions, you see that we are trying to apply a one-size-fits-all solution, which is, of course, very good and very helpful for consumers. But at the same time, we're seeing the trouble of not being able to accommodate all of these different specificities that food and drink have. Most of these companies that we represent, except perhaps those that are purely serving the B2B market, are in daily contact with consumers, and they are in daily fight every day to win the trust and loyalty of those consumers time and time and again. And companies that are not listening to consumers, they will lose out on market space and market share vis-a-vis others in a very highly competitive marketplace. What we can see overall is that consumers are increasingly interested in environment and health, but also they expect food to be affordable, they expect food to be tasty, convenient, enjoyable, ethically sourced, and more. So the expectations from consumers are high, they are diverse, and they are rapidly evolving. And it's up to these food companies to tap into that in the best possible way. In general, we see that price still consistently comes out in surveys as the main purchasing motivation, followed by quality aspects such as taste, but also practical considerations like the durability date of a product. But change is visible. A recent study by Deloitte about conscious consumers, for instance, revealed that when consumers have to choose between health and affordability, an average of 60% chose health as the first prime motivation. And that number is even higher in countries like Spain and Italy, where that was 80%. At the same time, that same study also revealed that only 29% would choose sustainability over affordability. And sustainability is, in this case, environmental sustainability. At the same time, in that study, also 70% of the people that were interviewed claimed to be willing to accept a price that is 5% higher or more for foods that are sustainably sourced. So you see, of course, you need to always be cautious about these kind of surveys. There's often a difference between what consumers say they want and what they do in practice, and that so-called say-do gap. But these results are interesting because it shows that people are more interested in the way how food is produced, where it comes from, and also to some degree are willing to pay a higher price for it. And it also shows that knowledge about sustainable consumption is very complex, and consumers find that maybe too multi-layered to understand and to really use that in their everyday shopping. So there's quite some work to be done, and this is also where Mr. Dorfman hinted at, to make sure that we unravel something which is very complex into simple, understandable pieces without this becoming simplistic. Of course, sustainable production, sustainable consumption is very much connected to sustainable production. And I don't know if many people are aware, but 1 out of 2 products in the supermarket shelves today will be replaced or will have been replaced or reformulated within a period of 5 years' time. So if you go 5 years from now into a supermarket, half of the shelves will look completely differently. And I think that's because of the work that is ongoing in our sector, in support of the European Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy to move towards circular economy models, to improve the resource efficiency, working with suppliers and farmers towards regenerative agriculture, and also looking at nutritional composition of products. So even without it being visible, there's a lot of work going on the production side to improve the sustainability of products that is not always communicated, but that will make products that are on the market will be more and more produced sustainably. There's a wider diversity of nutritious options on the market. So that's a win for consumers. So of course, how does food information weigh into all of this? As consumers buy food and drinks for a variety of different reasons, some they do it for health reasons, others for environmental reasons, but also some for convenience or just for fun, having something to celebrate. We believe that product information should first and foremost need to bear the essential information that would allow them to make an informed choices in a simple, factual, and importantly, a non-judgmental way. So by providing that information in a trustful manner, you can create further awareness, you can help to promote this shift towards more sustainable and healthy diets. Often when we talk about food information, we talk about front-of-pack nutrition labeling, and particularly here in the Brussels bubble. But it is also true that companies are providing recipe advice. So how do I use the different products together? How do I, what kind of portions should I consume? So there are recommendations about portions. There are instructions also on the storage of food. How do I keep my food fresh and how do I store it? Tips to avoid food waste at home. And these kind of simple harmonized instructions on, for instance, food waste prevention or recycling could also already help consumers take action and reduce the environmental footprint of their diets. Just now going to the policy side, we've always welcomed the Food Information to Consumers regulation. This year is the 10-year anniversary of that. We like it because it has created a framework for harmonized food information in the EU, even though we continue to see this unwanted fragmentation in the single market practice. And now with the Farm to Fork strategy, we are eagerly looking at these discussions that are taking place on the legislative framework on sustainable food systems, on the sustainable food information framework. And it provides an opportunity to reflect on how we can arrive at a common definition, common methodologies and standards to underpin food sustainability. And they're also in relation to food information, of course. So there are a few observations in that regard. First of all, before heading into the next chapter of food information, there's still quite a lot of unfinished business of the current Food Information to Consumers regulation, which could already help to promote sustainable consumption at relatively low cost. For instance, we have called together with the European Vegetarian Union and also now with Eurocommerce on the Commission to proceed with putting forward a legislative proposal on an EU harmonized definition for foods suitable for vegan and vegetarians. And that is really low-hanging fruit, forgive me the pun, but that would help already to implement the sustainable food systems agenda now and of course, you know, in the legislative process, this takes time, and before we have a sustainable food labeling framework, we will be years ahead. So these are measures that can be taken now, and we would hope that the Commission follows. Secondly, I believe that any future discussion on food information would first merit an evaluation of where we stand today. So how effective is labeling? Are consumers looking at it? Are they motivated by looking at it? Do they understand it, and do they act upon it? What is working, what is not? Which are the target groups in unhealthy diets, unsustainable diets that we need to look at? Do we have a mapping of dietary consumption intakes across the European population? Because if we don't have that baseline, it's very difficult to target information. And we are somewhat disappointed there that the Commission has not taken the opportunity of this impact assessment that is currently launching to take this broader holistic reflection rather than just focusing on several aspects of labeling. Thirdly, I think an important point is that labeling schemes are popping up like mushrooms in all places for various purposes. And whether you talk about animal welfare or nutrition or origin, and while that of course shows increasing interest in consumer information, this situation is not tenable. For environmental labeling alone, we've counted over 230 schemes that are active today on the European market. And if you look at it globally, there are over 450. That's crazy. And so we really urge member states not to push their individual schemes. Often these are backed by nationalistic motivations, but really centralize these discussions in Brussels. And also the Commission should step up to really act as the guardian of the treaty to avoid these national initiatives that fragment. Fourthly, I think Mr. Dorfman has already said it, sustainability and health is a complex notion. So what is environmentally sustainable may not necessarily be healthy. Organic is a great model of production, but may not in all cases be better for the environment or better for health. So a future approach to sustainable food information needs to be simple, but not simplistic. And there needs to be space to clarify those nuances for such a complex matter. And you can't do that by a color or a logo or anything like that. So there needs to be a space. And also for companies, particularly the smaller ones, we need to also be able to simplify these complex methodologies that are underpinning food information, like, for instance, footprint. Lastly, last point that I'd like to make is that public discussions that we are facing, and we've seen that in the Farm to Fork discussions with the Parliament, public discussions on sustainability of food systems and of diets are increasingly becoming polarized. And that is very unhealthy, very unhelpful trend if we are to seriously tackle the problems and the challenges associated with the way that we produce and consume food. And that also means that approaches to consumer information should be inclusive, they should be objective and non-discriminatory. So people should not feel ashamed, they should not feel guilty or fear to choose foods when they see a label at a glance. And I really am convinced that dietary change is possible without naming and shaming. And rather, if producers in all categories are properly incentivized, if they have their reward, and consumer awareness of healthy and sustainable diets is growing, then change can really happen. So these are some additional considerations. Thank you very much. I'm happy to engage further.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Sabine, let me turn to you now. You heard there from Dirk a lot of interesting points he raised, including some criticism towards the Commission for maybe the impact assessment not being holistic enough, not taking into account enough aspects and focusing maybe too much of a narrow vision maybe on certain aspects of labelling. The floor is yours now, Sabine, to respond to this. We might have lost Sabine there.
Sorry.
Hello.
No, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Okay. I can, yes.
Yeah, can I have the slides? Are you going to put the slides on the screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. First, I would like to thank SAFE for the organization of such an event. It is true that it's really coming at the right moment, and I would like to thank you for inviting the Commission. I am Sabine Pelser, and I'm the head of unit of the unit dealing with food information and composition in DG Santé. And we are responsible of this new initiative under the Farm to Fork strategy on the front of pack nutrition labeling. Can you go to the next slide, please? Next one. Yes, I'm going to start with the context. So, and I think we need a little bit of history in this context. So you probably know that front of pack nutrition labeling, what is the current situation? So we have the FIC regulation, so food information to consumer regulation. And since December 2016, so 5 years ago, pretty much 5 years ago, there was the obligation for all food products to present a mandatory nutrition declaration. So this is a little table that you have usually at the back of the pack of the food, presenting the essential nutrient of your food. The indication on the front of pack of some nutrition information was possible, but it was on a voluntary basis. So we have currently some, let's say, guidance in the FIC regulation, but if it's provided on the front of pack, it is on a voluntary basis. And we have on the EU market or under development a number of formats that are just presented here in this on this slide. So you can see that some of them, they are nutrient specific, some are more, let's say, providing an overall nutrition quality of the food, some have colors, indicators, some have no colors. So we have let's say a number of schemes which are currently used on the EU market, and some have been developed but not used yet. Next slide, please. So you all know that the Commission has made the announcement last year in 2022 with the Farm to Fork strategy, but at the same time, the Commission had adopted a report on the front of pack nutrition labeling. The report was an obligation coming from the FIC regulation, and it was built on a literature review adopted by the Joint Research Center. And what is the conclusion of this report? It says that front of pack schemes have the potential to help consumers make health conscious food choices, and it is appropriate to introduce harmonized mandatory front of pack labeling. Why? Because we have, let's say, a development of a number of schemes on the EU market, which is difficult for FBOs first well, it's more difficult, let's say, for the internal market, and there could be also a problem for consumers, a confusion problem if the consumer is faced with a different types of schemes. And in addition, the report clearly says, and I agree with Mr. Dorfman, that front of pack, it's one potential tool to help consumers, but the Commission fully agrees that it's not the only tool that should be given to consumers to help them to make healthier food choices. We also believe that education is key, and the Data Commission will be able to harmonize a front of pack nutrition scheme. It will accompany this scheme with some education, some education campaigns. So we'll work closely with the member states to ensure that the consumer understand the information that is provided to them. And then in parallel, other education campaigns should continue to take place. So the Farm to Fork strategy so clearly announced that the Commission will propose a harmonized mandatory front of pack nutrition labeling by the end of 2022. And at the same time, also address the question of the setting of nutrient profiles to restrict the promotion of food high in some, let's say, negative nutrient. Voilà, so this is one, let's say, one big initiative that the Commission is currently considering together. Next slide, please. So the objective of this initiative on the harmonization of front of pack nutrition labeling, it's really twofold. First, it's to help consumers to see at a glance the essential nutrition information when the consumer is purchasing food. And at the same time, it is also there to incentivize food business operators to reformulate their food to ensure that some of the nutrients which are not supposed to be consumed at high level could be reduced by providing the information to consumers. Next slide, please. So the Commission has started this exercise of the announced in the Farm to Fork strategy by launching what we call an impact assessment. You know that any legislative proposal proposed by the Commission is always accompanied by an impact assessment. The first step of an impact assessment is to publish what we call an Inception impact assessment. So to communicate to stakeholders, member states, and to the public what the Commission has in mind and which options it will put on the table. So this document was published end of last year, and it clearly highlights the different options the Commission is currently considering in this exercise. So you can see that the different schemes which are currently either already used on the market or being developed in the EU are being assessed to see the impact on consumers, on food business operators, but I will develop that later on. We are also assessing a possible combination between those schemes. I have heard a lot of criticism for some of the schemes. We are really aware about those criticisms, and we are also trying to see if combination of the existing schemes could be a reply to the criticism and the concerns. Next slide, please. So for this publication of the Inception Impact Assessment, we have received more than 400 comments. So it shows really the interest of all for these initiatives. Here you have the distribution of the comments. You can see that a lot of EU citizens have participated to this consultation, also business, NGOs. So we have really a broad, let's say, representation of the society. Next slide, please. So what are the reactions? This is extremely interesting. Reaction from the business association and companies. So in general, the business association, they support the harmonization of a front of pack nutrition labeling, but they would like this front of pack to be voluntary and not mandatory and based on portion and not on 100 grams on 100 milliliters. But there are divergent views about the choice of the type of front of pack nutrition labeling, be it a non-evaluative scheme or an evaluative scheme. And then there is also some request to assess the combination of options. When we go to the comments coming from public health and consumer NGOs, the view is different. They support a harmonized mandatory front of pack nutrition labeling based on 100 grams. And they believe and they consider that exemption to the application of this front of pack scheme should be based on scientific consideration and not commercial grounds. And they support really an evaluative scheme which really provides to consumers an indication on which food should be preferably chosen compared to another one. If we go to academia and nutritionists, it's the same. They generally favor the introduction of a harmonized mandatory front of pack scheme and express the preference for evaluative color-coded scheme. And then citizens, the same, harmonized mandatory front of pack, but they have different views on the type of scheme. Next slide. So nutrient profiles, I'm not going to say more in this context because we don't have time. So I would propose to go to the next slide, which are the evidence the Commission is currently, let's say, gathering to ensure that we have a decision which is based on science, on evidence, on impact, and then we have, let's say, a decision which is really an informed decision. So we have, in addition to the impact assessment that we are currently conducting, we have asked the Joint Research Center to proceed with a further literature review, to update the literature review that was made for the drafting of the report from the Commission in 2020. And in addition, we have asked the GRC to focus on some additional specific points, like for example, the presence of front of pack and claims on the label, how the consumer understands information which are provided to consumers and which might be sometimes contradictory. Also the question of the highly processed food versus the traditional product. So what type of information would the consumer receive? Do they want only information on processed food, but also traditional products? So it's really an open question. Then we have in parallel asked the European Food Safety Authority to provide a scientific advice to the Commission for the development of a harmonized mandatory front of pack nutrition labeling and for the setting of nutrient profiles. So we will EFSA will launch very soon a public consultation on the draft they have finalized a few days ago. And this public consultation should end by the end of this year. And then the scientific opinion by EFSA will be finalized in March next year. Next slide. So as I said, we have launched the impact assessment, and we have also launched a study to support the impact assessment, because we have to gather a lot of evidence to really take the right decision. So the purpose and the scope of this study is to identify and collect evidence, as I said, and to carry out a detailed and data-driven analysis. So we will consult and we will launch a consultation with stakeholders, with the member states, with the public, to really gather the existing evidence and be able to analyze and compare the economic, social, and environmental impact of the proposed policy options. And we will also explore the possibility to apply specific conditions to certain categories of food. So we have heard a lot of concerns coming from many stakeholders and from some member states. So we are really considering all possibilities for a future front-of-pack nutrition labeling. So just to be quick, a public consultation will be launched before the end of November on front-of-pack nutrition labeling, but also on the other initiatives under the Food Information to Consumer regulation. And then we will have a little bit later in the year targeted consultation with stakeholders and with member states. We will have also the organization of workshops, interview, targeted surveys, and also some case studies. Next slide, please.
I will just ask you just to wrap up as quickly as you can, Sabine, because you have just 30 seconds more. Okay.
Yeah. So next steps. What are the next steps? So the study has been launched, and it will support the impact assessment. In parallel, we have the GRC study and the EFSA advice. Finalization of the impact assessment is foreseen for next year, Q2 of next year, and then we will have the drafting of the legislative proposal just after, and the adoption of the proposal by the Commission by the end of 2022. And then will come after the negotiation with the co-legislators, the Parliament and the Council in the course of 2023. And hopefully we will be able to have an agreement well, as soon as possible. So I would like to thank you again, and I'm open, of course, for some questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And now let me turn, last but not least, to Nikolai. Nikolai, the floor is yours for your remarks.
Thank you so much for the invitation. So my name is Nikolai, indeed, European Public Health Alliance, which is an alliance of health NGOs across Europe. And yeah, I will try to make a few remarks about labeling, which is always a hotly debated issue indeed. And I'll try to be as brief as possible so we actually have time to debate. So for us, adequate food labeling is indeed a key pillar of healthy, sustainable food environments. And with the understanding that healthy food environments, they help create the conditions for people to choose healthy, sustainable diets. Now, I think hearing the discussion up to now, I think we all very much agree that labeling is not a silver bullet. And we pointed out in a recent joint policy briefing on food environments, there are actually many measures that need to be adopted, including restrictions on marketing. And just yesterday, we launched a blueprint directive on how this can actually be done at an EU level, but also pricing interventions by looking at availability, looking at public procurement, of how that can be improved, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, labeling is not something that can be overlooked either. And I mean, as we see it currently on the agenda, there's actually 4 key aspects related to labeling. Of course, front of pack, in a way, the big question, but also, of course, the health and nutrition claims, alcohol labeling, and the environmental and, let's say, wider sustainability labeling as well. And I'll focus mainly on the front of pack part. I mean, I think to the question of evidence, there is evidence quite significant already that a well-designed front of pack scheme can help consumers identify healthier food options and also promote the uptake of healthier diets, but also foster reformulation of products. Now, From our perspective, a front of pack scheme, so a well-designed one, should be first and foremost based on the mission to promote good health, be based on independent evidence, indeed, as said, be mandatory, interpretative, based on uniform reference values, be mixed in terms of highlighting both the positives and less positives, and should include alcoholic beverages, clearly. Now, if I'm observing the policy debate, I'm actually quite concerned about pretty much all of these points, but I'll just want to highlight a few, and actually starting with the most basic one, namely the point of being based on the mission to promote good health, which in a way should not be really even a question at all, because that's the ultimate point of having such scheme. However, if you look at it, unfortunately, sometimes it looks like there's as if some countries are kind of looking at the list of their own signature products and check against a proposed scheme whether to see whether those products fare well. And when that's not the case, it's not to the taste. The scheme is being demonized, frankly, and or kind of suggested to ditch it. Or indeed, carve-outs are proposed, for instance, for products with geographical indications, which in our point of view, it doesn't make sense, because these nutrition and traditional qualities are totally different attributes. They do not cancel each other out. They stand next to each other. Then there's a movement indeed to ensure that such a scheme is voluntary, which removes the entire point, because you remove the comparability across food products. Sometimes we see the issue flaring up whether or not it should be based on portion sizes. And maybe you have recalled there was an initiative called the Evolved Nutrition Label Initiative that was launched some years ago by a few companies, which was based on portion sizes. Well, eventually the main proponents of the initiative actually moved out of the scheme because it would not fly. I mean, basing on portion sizes is simply too confusing for consumers. And also what you kind of often hear is this sort of indignation that front of pack is not holistic enough, that it's too much of a shortcut, and it doesn't really do justice to the full nature of a food product. And well, frankly, yes, it is a shortcut, and that's the whole purpose of it. It's to help people get a sense at a glance about the relevant nutritional aspects of a certain food. And I can only totally agree with what was said now. It should be simple, not simplistic. Yes, for sure. But it should also not be in abstract, but exactly linked to the current dietary situation. Because we have to understand that both labeling, but also all the other interventions that have been tested, devised to improve food environments, they are a response to something, and that something is essentially a food system that has gone quite badly wrong. Because, I mean, if we look, it's unhealthy diet is one of the main, if not the main, risk factors for Europe's entire burden of disease. This means lots of suffering, lots of disabilities, lots of lives that can't be lived to full flourishing. It's embedding inequalities in our societies further. It's undermining sustainability of healthcare systems. It's a huge drain to the economy, not only in direct costs, but also productivity-related costs. OECD, they had a report not so long ago about obesity. Basically, they calculated that only on the basis of a 20% reduction in calorie content of energy-dense foods across 42 countries, that is, there would be a reduction of 1 million non-communicable disease cases per year, over 13 billion US dollars saved in terms of healthcare costs, 1.4 million full-time work hours added per year, 0.5% increase in GDP, etc. So this is huge. We're talking about huge numbers. And I think this is really clear when we're speaking about indignation. This is what we should be looking at as the context within which all this debate takes place. Just very brief on the environmental and, let's say, wider sustainability labeling. So to the extent that the Commission's initiative will actually help create this common baseline for a wide variety of labels has been mentioned on the market, to have a common baseline for them to reduce risk of greenwashing, I think this is a very good idea. However, sometimes you hear this floating around to create an all-encompassing label that would weigh all the various environmental, nutrition, social dimensions together and come with a kind of joint score. And here I would be quite concerned, because all these aspects are really important, but it's not necessarily clear how you can weigh them together and put them all into one. It might just lose its purpose and become ultimately confusing. And finally, on alcohol and claims, I think we can be very brief. So alcohol should simply be covered by the Food Information to Consumer Regulation, like all other drinks are. And well, nutrient profiles, they need to be adopted for claims. Again, we all know how many years we are over time. And I should add, whether it is the same profile, nutrient profile as for the front of pack or not, I mean, you can argue about it. It's not inconsistent to have different ones, but if one for two can work and it's fine, well, why not? Hopefully I've stuck to time, so I really look forward to debate further with you.
You have indeed stuck to time. Thank you very much for that, Nikolai. I raised a lot of really interesting points there. So let me get stuck into the discussion. I think, unfortunately, we might have lost Herbert for the moment. We're going to try and bring him back. But while we wait, let me put a question firstly to Dirk. I just want to raise something here actually that Nikolai just touched upon. And also there was a question from the audience actually on the same theme. So, Nikolai was speaking about voluntary commitments. The question from the audience is whether, Dirk, you believe that voluntary commitments and demand-driven actions are enough to meet the Farm to Fork goals on healthy diets. Maybe you can comment on that and respond to that, Dirk.
Yes, thank you. Let me first of all say that we are, as Food Drink Europe, very supportive of the Farm to Fork strategy. So we see this really as a step towards a common EU food policy. And this is something that we've been asking for since a long, long time, because we see that also in the policy area, food has been very much fragmented. And even today, we cannot just afford to look only at the Farm to Fork strategy, but we also need to look at other parts of the Green Deal, when you talk about packaging, for instance, or when you talk about biodiversity. So I think this is also where this sustainable food system regulated framework comes in. And we believe that this should be a combination of legislation, but also of voluntary elements. And you may know that recently we've adopted an EU Code of Conduct for responsible food business and marketing practices. Now that in itself will not be sufficient, and that will have to be backed up by legislation. I think the industry is quite often an asking partner for legislation to harmonize, to create a level playing field. But we do also need to have at the same time the flexibility to operate. And this is why you, for instance, see that we're asking for harmonization at the EU level, for instance, when it comes to things like nutrition labeling, but keeping some flexibility within. There are some schemes that are currently on the market, like for instance, I'm taking the example of the keyhole, that are working very well in the Scandinavian countries, that have been adopted since many years and that have been implemented by companies. Consumers are familiar to it. So are we going to ditch that when we are coming with something different? So I think we need to have a harmonized framework, and that can be legislation, but that allows still for some flexibility. And again, that also manages the complexity that food is. We're sometimes a little bit too much focused on individual foods, whereas we're talking about diets. Now, when you go to the supermarket, you're buying your products not on an individual level, but you're thinking already about the meals that you're going to make from it, or the family you are going to feed. So I think we need to also take a little bit a step back, and that's why what I meant with this reflection. Let's try to find a bit of a way how we can accommodate that complexity in a more simple way that is easy to understand for consumers.
Nikolai, perhaps you'd like to respond to that. You were the one that raised that issue. What's your response to the answer we just had there?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think, as Dick mentioned, I mean, we have been involved also in the code of conduct that was mentioned. And I mean, our approach is indeed, as we've stated quite a few times, that voluntary commitments can play a role, but they can never be the leading driver of change. And this is entirely in line with what the EU own chief scientists say, basically. So there's clearly that, and whenever so we'd be saying that where regulation is more effective and where there it should be applied, because it creates this level playing field across Europe, and there will always be lots of areas where indeed individual actions can contribute. So it is about getting this right, but it's very clear. I mean, if you look at the urgency we are in, and really the challenges in front of us, we really need to have these areas where we move forward quickly. And I think I totally agree that it is not just about individual foods. We are ultimately looking at diets, but diets also consist of individual foods. And I think the approach of thinking through the lens of food environments is really useful to be able to navigate exactly this question. Where does the relevance of individual products come in? But also, indeed, how you create this systemic approach towards making sure that diets are both healthy and sustainable. Because the food environments framework really departs from the evidence of consumer experience, of people's experience. And this experience is that contexts to a very large degree, determine what people buy and eat.
Thank you for that. We have actually a question from a leftist MEP, Anya Hasenkamp here from the audience. The question is to Sabine. So Anya would like to know whether that, so touching upon the idea that actually, you know, food packaging and labeling is also important, not just for the nutritional elements of food, but the environmental profile of the product. So Anya has asked whether there is any possibility of a label indicating the amount of CO2 emitted per 100 grams of a product. She says many consumers would like to know this to lower their own carbon footprint, and this would incentivize companies to lower theirs. And at the COP26, I know this week there was, you know, food products labeled with carbon emissions. Sabine, what is your thought on this?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. As it was already said by some of the speakers, of the panel members, the Commission has also committed to come with a sustainable with a sustainability labeling framework by end of 2024. So it means that the Commission is currently reflecting on which information could be provided to consumers. And I just would like to remind you that when we speak about sustainability label, we are really talking about the different dimension of sustainability. So the environmental dimension, the social dimension, including health, and then the economic dimension. So the Commission is really reflecting on how more information could be provided to consumers in addition to the nutritional information. And you have to know as well that the Commission is currently working on what we call the green claims legislation. So it's an initiative from the Commission, dealt by DG Environment, and it's an initiative for how information on the environmental impact of some product, including food, so it's on all product, but it includes food, should be provided to consumers. So there is a question of methodology. There is also the question of presentation. So the Commission is really currently reflecting, let's say, hardly on how information could be, let's say, harmonized at European level to ensure that consumers are not confused, are not misled, and of course the CO2 emission is part of the reflection. I cannot tell you what will be the outcome of this reflection, what will be proposed by the Commission, but it is really part of the current discussion under the Farm to Fork strategy and under the Green the Green Deal. Sorry, yeah, it's part of the reflection, and something will come out. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you very much for that. I have a question here from the audience for Dirk. Dirk, in your opening statement, you were speaking about kind of all these beyond front of pack labeling, all these different information that's provided to consumers. You mentioned things like recipes, portion sizes, food waste, storage, all of which is so important. Environmentally, we have a question from the audience who would like to know what you consider to be the most essential when establishing what should be displayed on a product.
That's a very pertinent question, and I'm afraid I don't have the answer here, but the point of essential versus not so or less essential information will become critical, because there is an increasing demand for information. We want to, if you ask consumers, do you want to have information on this or on that, they always say yes, and I'm like that as well. But there is only limited space on the label. So I think we have to have a fundamental discussion on what is the kind of information that is absolutely essential. I would say, first of all, food safety related is always critical, because that is something that is a matter of life and death in some cases. But there needs to be more discussion. And I think another point related to that is the opportunities that digital solutions also provide. So given that we don't have a lot of space on the label, we need to confine that information in a very clear way and have that essential information that allows consumers to make the informed choices in the supermarkets. But then there's also a wealth of information that companies can share about things like carbon footprint, about the way products or ingredients are sourced, etc. That does not necessarily have to go on the label, but that can be done via smartphones, via apps, via websites, and so forth. And I think we need to explore a bit more that side of the equation as well. And it's complementary. You have essential information that has to be there on the label, but you also have additional information that you can provide. And that's, I think we are not tapping yet into that opportunity in the way we can. And that's also part of the sustainable food systems discussion.
Yeah, digital labeling, very interesting, especially we're all getting more and more used to using QR codes these days with COVID and everything else. So that's definitely an interesting point that you raised there. I have a question here from the audience for Nikolai. Nikolai, it's actually something I was also going to raise. You mentioned some other necessary and complementary measures to help ensure healthy and sustainable food environments aside from labeling, things like marketing, pricing. Would you be able to kind of specify a bit further about this and maybe give a bit more detail about the report? I think you briefly mentioned a report, and perhaps you could give a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah, thanks, definitely. So, well, I can actually maybe go a bit more in depth on the marketing part, but I can also, well, further down the line, share the report on food environments, the wider one we did together in light of the so-called EU Food Policy Coalition. Now, but we just yesterday we launched actually a directive. So we, our legal advisors, drafted how a directive could look like at an EU level to actually end and put to an end this the malpractice, I would say, of marketing nutritionally poor, let's say, unhealthy products in a way that they reach kids and that kids are exposed to them. So what we are proposing is to end the marketing of such foods between 6 a.m. and 11 p.m. on broadcast media, so television and radio, which is almost more or less what is now being proposed in the UK, so kind of reasonable. Entirely ended on digital media, so including social media, video sharing platform, likewise quite close to what's being proposed in the UK. And sponsorship by food brands of cross-border events, such as sports cultural events, unless a brand can prove actually that such sponsorship is not associated with nutritionally poor food. And the use of marketing techniques appealing to children, for instance, on food packages. We all know the cartoon characters that are being used on, sugar-filled. Well, it's a very used example on the sugar-filled breakfast-filled cereals, etc. But also the use of influencers on social media. And quite importantly, we really need to be clear that a child is any person under the age of 18. So not, as we sometimes hear, 12. I mean, actually, adolescence is an age, a very sensitive developmental age where marketing has vast impact. So there's no sense at all and no evidence at all to link it, to limit it to 12, which is quite often the age, or 13 maybe, as now sometimes proposed. But next, marketing is really super important, but there are other, and we identify 7 other areas where how food environments could be improved, of which labeling is one of the 7. So marketing, labeling, food environment, public procurement, and a number more, but I can further share, not to take up all the time.
Thank you very much. No, it was a very comprehensive overview of that. we're coming to the end of the first panel now. But let me ask one more question. I have one more question here for Sabine. So the question here is what the Commission response is and what the answer is to the concept that Nikolai raised of food environments. And perhaps you could comment on that, and maybe also comment on the previous intervention of Nikolai. Oh, Sabine, you're still muted.
Yes. Okay.
Hello. Yes.
What I mean, if you check the farm to fork strategy, the Commission has clearly also highlighted the problem of the food environment, which is not considered as being, let's say, how it should be. And the Commission has made the link between the food environment and the problem of obesity in the EU. So I agree with what Nicola said, that to ensure that this food environment is let's say modified and let's say incentivize consumers to choose healthier food choices. There are a number of tools and initiatives that have been proposed in the farm to fork strategy. So the food labeling is one of those options, but we have also other initiatives that are proposed there. So it's the setting of nutrient profiles to restrict claims on food, which do not have, let's say, a good nutritional status. It's also to work on food procurement. So there are a number of initiatives that have been put in place really with the objective of changing the food environment and really incentivize consumers to choose healthier food choices, but also to be faced with products which are healthier. So this is really one of the big objectives of the farm to fork strategy, amongst, of course, other objectives. But it's really there, and it's clearly, let's say, explained in the strategy.
Excellent, thank you very much. And that brings our first panel discussion to a close. We are just about on time, so thank you very much for that.